The dust was a living thing in the borderlands of 1886. It rose from the red earth in ghostly plumes, coating Clara May's patched dress, settling in the lines around her eyes, and grinding between her teeth with every weary breath. For 3 weeks, she had walked this parched landscape where Colorado bled into New Mexico, a ghost herself, haunted by a life she had barely escaped. She carried nothing but a small burlap sack with a change of linen and a hardness in her belly that was part hunger, part resolve. In each dusty settlement, a saloon, a general store, and a handful of sun-bleached houses huddled together as if for comfort. The answer had been the same. A polite but firm shake of the head. It wasn't her tired face or her thin frame that sealed her fate. It was the mottled, purple-yellow bruises that circled her left wrist like a grotesque bracelet. She'd tried to hide them, pulling the frayed cuff of her sleeve down. But a gesture, a moment of forgetfulness, was all it took. A storekeeper's wife, her eyes darting from Clara's face to her wrist and back again, would suddenly find her storeroom fully stocked. A blacksmith would gruffly claim he had no need for a cook or a cleaner. The bruises told a story people did not want to hear, a story of trouble that clung to her like the trail dust. They saw a woman who had been struck, and they saw a problem they did not wish to invite across their threshold. So she kept walking, the sun a hammer against her skull, until the silhouette of a ranch appeared through the shimmering heat haze. McAllister Ranch, the signpost had said 5 miles back. Its letters faded and split. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the vast, unforgiving emptiness that surrounded it. A long, low ranch house sat squat against the earth, flanked by a sturdy-looking barn, a web of corrals, and a scatter of smaller outbuildings, all built of the same weathered, unpainted timber. As she drew closer, the wind picked up, a hot, dry gale that whipped sand into her eyes and hissed through the sparse, thorny scrub. The land itself was cracked and thirsty. The earth split into a web of fissures like an old man's palm. In the distance, the faint, lonely music of a cattle bell drifted on the air, a sound so forlorn it made her heart ache. She clutched her sack tighter and pushed through the gate, the wind trying to force her back. A man was coming out of the barn as she approached. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, moving with a kind of contained stillness that seemed at odds with the restless wind. His face was all harsh angles and sun-weathered leather, shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes, a startling, pale blue in his tanned face, narrowing with suspicion. This was Boone McAllister. She knew it with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach. He looked like a man who had been carved from the land itself, hard and unyielding. "Looking for something?" His voice was a low rumble, devoid of welcome. Clara swallowed the dust in her throat. "Work, sir. I'm looking for work." He gave her a slow, deliberate appraisal, from the scuffed toes of her boots to her sunburnt face. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on her sleeve, and she instinctively tucked her left hand behind her back. "We ain't hiring." "I can do anything," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm a hard worker. All I ask is a meal and a place to sleep." The desperation in her voice hung in the air between them. For a moment, she thought he would tell her to move on, just like all the others. He looked past her, toward the endless horizon, his jaw tight. "My cook walked out 3 days ago," he said, more to the wind than to her. Said the quiet was driving him mad. He looked back at her, his eyes flinty. "You bring trouble with you, woman?" It was not a question of her past. It was a diagnosis of her present. He saw the bruises she tried to hide, the fear she tried to master. He saw the trouble. "The only trouble I have is an empty stomach, sir," she replied, meeting his gaze. He considered her for a long, silent moment, the wind whipping a loose strand of her brown hair across her face. Finally, he gave a curt nod toward the ranch house. "Kitchen's in the back. It's a mess. You can cook for the hands tonight. If the food's decent and you ain't a thief, You can stay on for a bit. Bed in the lean-to next to the pantry. That's the deal." He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and strode back toward the barn, his long-legged gait eating up the ground. Clara watched him go, a shiver running through her despite the heat. She had a place for one night. At least, she had a place. The kitchen was worse than he'd said. It was a place of filth and neglect. A film of greasy dust covered every surface. Dirty pots and pans were stacked in the dry sink, and the air was thick with the sour smell of spoiled food and old smoke. For another woman, it might have been a final insult. For Clara, it was a task. A task was something she could understand, something she could conquer. She rolled up her sleeves, carefully, over the bruised wrist, and set to work. She hauled water from the well, heated it on the big cast-iron stove, and began to scrub. She scoured the grease from the pots, scrubbed the wooden countertops until the clean scent of lye soap filled the small room, and swept the floor clear of its accumulated grime. As she worked, she took stock of the pantry. It was well stocked with basics: flour, beans, salted pork, coffee, potatoes, onions. Simple, hearty fare for hard-working men. By the time the sun began its slow descent, casting long purple shadows across the plains, the kitchen was transformed. It was clean, orderly, and filled with the savory aroma of a bubbling stew. She had found a stash of dried herbs and worked them into the mix, along with potatoes and onions. She baked a pan of cornbread, its golden brown crust a small beacon of warmth in the stark room. The ranch hands, 5 of them, filed in as dusk settled, their faces grimy with the day's labor. They were loud and rough, scraping their chairs across the floor of the main room and talking in low voices. They glanced at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and speculation, before turning their attention to their plates. Boone McAllister came in last. He moved to the head of the long table, taking his seat without a word. He filled his plate from the pot of stew she brought to the table, and took a large piece of cornbread. The room fell quiet as the men ate. The only sounds, the scrape of spoons on tin plates and the mournful cry of the wind outside. Clara stood by the stove, her hands clasped before her, watching him. He ate with a grim efficiency, his focus entirely on his food. He gave no sign of approval, no word of praise, but when he was finished, his plate was clean, wiped bare with the last of his cornbread. One by one, the other men finished, leaving their own plates just as empty. It was the only compliment she would get, and it was enough. As she moved to clear the table, her sleeve rode up, exposing the dark marks on her wrist under the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. She saw Boone's eyes drop to them. It was not a glance. It was a sharp, focused look, an assessment. The air grew thick and still. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Without thinking, she pulled the cuff down sharply and turned away, her back to him as she gathered the plates. She did not speak, and he did not ask. Later, as she washed the dishes in the now clean kitchen, she could hear the low murmur of the hands from the porch where they smoked their pipes. The wind carried snippets of their conversation to her. "A beaten widow, I tell ya," a gravelly voice said. "Seen the marks on her. I reckon Boone's just looking for a warm body to keep his bed." Another, younger voice snickered. "Won't last a month." The words were like stones, striking her one by one. She closed her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the sink. They saw her not as a person, but as a condition, a victim. And they saw the man who had hired her not as a benefactor, but as a predator. Perhaps they were right. Her room, the lean-to, was little more than a closet with a hard, narrow cot, a thin blanket, and a single small window high on the wall. It was cold, and the wind found its way through the cracks in the boards, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. She lay down in the dark, fully clothed, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. Exhaustion pulled at her bones, but sleep offered no true escape. It came for her in the dead of night, the dream that was always the same, the sound of a heavy fist banging on a locked door, the splintering of wood, his voice, thick with whiskey and righteousness, shouting her name. She was running, but her feet were mired in mud, the hallway stretching into an impossible length. Clara awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of banging echoed in the small room, but it was only her own pulse in her ears. The room was silent, save for the ceaseless whisper of the wind. And then, another sound cut through the darkness, sharp and wild and achingly lonely. A coyote, howling at the sliver of moon hanging in the vast, star-dusted sky. She lay there, listening, her body trembling. The nightmare was from her past, but the coyote's cry was the sound of now. It was the voice of the wilderness she had come to, a place as wounded and solitary as she was, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone. The days at the McAllister Ranch settled into a rhythm, as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. A fragile truce existed between Clara and the vast, silent land, and between her and its master. Boone McAllister held himself at a distance, a solitary island in the sea of his own making. He never called her Clara, to him, and in his rare spoken commands. She was simply Cook. It was not unkind, merely a statement of fact, a word that defined her purpose and drew a clear, uncrossable line between them. Cook, the men will be out late. Cook, we'll need provisions from town. The name was a wall he built and maintained with grim determination. Yet a subtle shift occurred in the ranch's cadence before her arrival. The men had told her Boone would eat when he pleased, often taking a cold plate late at night in the barn. Alone, now. He started coming back at noon, punctually. He would stride in, hang his dusty hat on a peg by the door, and take his seat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room. He ate in the same focused silence as he had that first night, his gaze fixed on his plate. But he was there. His punctuality was a silent, grudging admission that a warm meal was waiting, that a small measure of order had been imposed on his life, and that he had come to expect it. The kitchen became Clara's world, a sanctuary she meticulously crafted from the husk of what it had been. She found a rhythm in the kneading of dough, a peace in the slow simmering of a stew. She rose before the first hint of dawn, the chill of the floorboards seeping through her stockings, and coaxed the stove to life. The smell of coffee and frying bacon was her daily offering to the waking house. With a needle and thread found in a forgotten biscuit tin, she mended the ranch's worn linens, her small, neat stitches a quiet rebellion against the fraying edges of their lives. On a piece of spare flour sack, she embroidered a single, determined desert marigold, its yellow thread a splash of impossible color against the drabness. She hung it by the stove, a dish towel no one had asked for. On Sundays, a day that was otherwise no different from the rest, she would bake an apple pie, its filling made from a sack of dried apples she'd found in the pantry, or a simple cinnamon-dusted cake. The hands, initially suspicious, devoured the treats with a boyish enthusiasm that briefly softened their rough edges. Boone never acknowledged the Sunday baking with a word, but she noticed he always took the largest slice. From her window over the dry sink, she watched him. She saw the way he moved, with an economy of motion that was both powerful and graceful. She watched him on his horse, a dark sorrel named Diablo, the two of them moving as one being against the backdrop of the jagged, distant mountains. He was a demanding teacher to the younger hands, especially a lanky, quiet boy named Eli. His voice would cut across the dusty corral, sharp and clear, correcting a thrown loop or a misplaced step. He rarely smiled and never laughed, but sometimes, in the quiet moments at the end of the day, he would stand alone by the corral fence, staring west toward the mountain range. In those moments, the harshness would fall away from his face, and his eyes, that startling blue, would fill with a sadness so profound it seemed to pull the light from the sky. It was a loneliness that she recognized, a sorrow that felt familiar, and it made her heart ache in a way that was dangerously close to compassion. One sweltering afternoon, she was returning from the well, the wooden yoke heavy across her shoulders, 2 full buckets of water sloshing with every step. The ground near the well was perpetually damp, and her worn-out boots slipped in the mud. The yoke twisted, and she went down hard, one knee striking a sharp stone hidden in the muck. Water and mud splashed everywhere, soaking her skirt. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot up her leg. She sat there for a moment, stunned, the empty buckets lying on their sides, her knee bleeding freely into the mud. Boone was crossing the yard from the barn. He saw her fall. He stopped, his body going still. For a long moment, she thought he would just turn and walk away, leaving her to her own clumsy misfortune. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. He gave no sign of concern, his expression as unreadable as ever. Then, he turned and continued on his way to the house without a word. Humiliation burned hotter than the pain in her knee. She blinked back tears of frustration, struggling to her feet and gathering the empty buckets. She had made a spectacle of herself, confirmed her uselessness. That evening, after she had served dinner and cleaned the kitchen, she retreated to her small room in the lean-to. Her knee throbbed, and she knew the scrape was deep and dirty. As she reached for the handle of her door, she saw it. Sitting on the packed earth just outside was a small basin of steaming water, a clean linen rag folded neatly beside it, and a small, dark bottle of carbolic acid. She stood frozen, staring at the offering. He hadn't spoken, hadn't offered a hand, hadn't acknowledged her pain in any public way, but he had seen, he had remembered, and in his own silent, remote way, he had provided. She carried the basin into her room, and as she cleaned the wound, her tears finally fell, though she wasn't entirely sure why. That night, by the light of a single, flickering candle, she took out a small, leather-bound book from the bottom of her burlap sack. It was a simple journal, its pages mostly empty. She dipped her pen into a small vial of ink and began to write, not about her day or her injury, but about him. Asterisk. He is like a cactus, growing alone in the desert. She wrote, the pen scratching softly in the quiet room. Asterisk covered in spines to keep the world away. You look at it and see only something that will hurt you if you get too close. But sometimes, it produces a single, beautiful flower. It is a beauty that is born from hardship, a painful kind of beauty. Weeks later, the sky turned a bruised, greenish gray. The air grew heavy and thick, and a strange stillness fell over the ranch. A storm was coming, not the usual summer squall, but something bigger, more violent. The rain started just after dusk, fat, heavy drops that quickly became a torrential downpour. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the small house to its foundations, and lightning tore the sky apart, casting the world in brief, skeletal flashes of white. Clara was trying to secure the wooden shutter on the kitchen window when a deafening crash echoed from the side of the house, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a cascade of water. She rushed outside, into the driving rain, and saw that a bolt of lightning had struck a cottonwood tree near the house. The force had torn the main rain gutter from the eaves, and a torrent of water was now pouring down the side of the house, threatening to flood the pantry. "Get back inside!" a voice roared over the storm. Boone was there, a dark shape in the maelstrom, already soaked. He grabbed a length of rope from a hook on the porch. Before she could react, he seized her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her bodily from the deluge and into the main room of the house. He shoved her toward the center of the room, away from the windows. "Stay put!" At that exact moment, another bolt of lightning struck, closer this time. The world outside the windows flared into brilliant, blinding white. For a single, eternal second, the dark room was illuminated as if by daylight. Clara stood there, gasping, her dress plastered to her body, her hair streaming water. and in that flash of stark, unforgiving light, he saw it. Her thin cotton dress, soaked through, clung to her back, revealing what it had always concealed. It was not smooth skin. It was a roadmap of old pain, a landscape of raised white lines, scars, a cluster of them, thin and crisscrossed, high on her left shoulder blade, another, longer and thicker, that ran diagonally across her lower back. They were not the marks of an accident. They were the deliberate, brutal calligraphy of a whip or a belt. The light vanished, plunging them back into darkness. The image seared into Boone's mind. The thunder rolled away, leaving a ringing silence in the room, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the sound of Clara's ragged breathing. She stood frozen, her arms crossed over her chest, knowing what he had seen. The exposure felt more violent than the storm. He didn't move. He stood by the door, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the porch. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the things they had never said. She could feel his eyes on her in the dark, and she braced herself for the question, the accusation, the pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, and stripped of all emotion but a terrifying intensity. It was a single question, cutting through the darkness with the clean finality of a knife. "He's still alive?" The question was not about who or why or how. It was about the present. It was about a threat. Clara's whole body trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. She couldn't find her voice, couldn't force a sound past the knot of fear in her throat. She could only manage a single, jerky nod in the gloom. Asterisk. Yes, asterisk. Boone said nothing more. He didn't curse. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He just stood there in the darkness, absorbing the truth. He turned his head and looked out into the raging storm, but she knew he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing the scars and the story they told. He said nothing, but in the crushing weight of his silence, Clara felt a strange and terrible thing. She felt understood. The storm passed as if it had never been, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. But inside the McAllister ranch house, the atmosphere remained heavy, charged with the unspoken knowledge that now lay between Boone and Clara. He knew. She knew that he knew. A new and fragile tension connected them, as palpable as a thread of spun glass. He said nothing of the scars. His morning greeting was the same gruff nod, his instructions still addressed to Cook. Yet, something had irrevocably shifted. When he looked at her, his gaze was no longer just suspicious or assessing. It held a deep, troubled stillness, as if he were looking at a puzzle whose missing pieces had suddenly, grimly, fallen into place. The ranch hands noticed the change. The air of protective quiet that Boone now cast around Clara was as obvious as a newly erected fence. Their speculation, once idle bunkhouse chatter, now took on a sharper, more malicious edge. They saw a hard man softening, and they didn't trust it. The whispers grew louder in the barn and on the porch after supper. The breaking point came on a blistering hot afternoon. Clara was hanging laundry on the line, the sun hot on the back of her neck, when Silas, a young hand with mean eyes and a perpetually cruel smirk, swaggered over to the water barrel nearby. He watched her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Working you hard, widow?" he drawled, loud enough for the other men mending tack nearby to hear. "Or is it just the boss that's working you hard at night?" He punctuated the vile insinuation with a lewd chuckle. Clara froze, her hands clutching a wet sheet. A cold wave of dread washed over her, the familiar prelude to a man's cruelty. Before she could even think to retreat, a shadow fell over them. Boone had come around the corner of the house, his movements unnervingly silent. He had heard every word. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The rage that emanated from him was more terrifying than any shout. He walked directly to Silas, who was still smirking, oblivious. "Pack your things," Boone said. his voice a low, deadly rumble. Silas's smirk faltered. "What? It was just a joke, boss." "You've got 10 minutes to be off my land," Boone continued, ignoring the excuse. "Then I'll consider you a trespasser." He took a step closer, and for the first time, Clara saw the killer that rumor claimed he was. It was in his eyes, a flat, cold promise of violence. "And if I ever see you near her again, I'll finish what I started." Silas paled, his bravado vanishing like a puff of smoke. He scrambled away without another word. Boone stood there for a long moment, his broad back to Clara, his fists clenched at his sides. The other men suddenly found their tack mending to be the most fascinating work they had ever done. Their heads bowed, avoiding his gaze. He had drawn a line in the sand for all to see. She was his to protect. He turned, and his eyes, when they met hers, were turbulent. He seemed to want to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gave a curt, almost angry nod, and strode away toward the barn, leaving her standing by the laundry line, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A week later, he returned from a trip to town. He handed her the usual sack of supplies, but underneath it was something else, a small, thin book, its cover worn and its pages yellowed with age. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. The title was printed in simple, block letters, asterisk gardening in arid soil asterisk. She looked up at him, bewildered. He just stood there, shifting his weight, looking anywhere but at her face. "Figured the dirt out back of the kitchen gets good sun," he mumbled, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "Thought you might find a use for it." It was such a strange, gentle, and profoundly thoughtful gesture that it caught her completely off guard. It was a gift that spoke of permanence, of putting down roots in this hard, dry place, and something inside her, a cord that had been stretched taut with grief and fear for years, suddenly snapped. A sound escaped her lips, a small, choked gasp that turned into a chuckle, and then into a full, uninhibited laugh. It was a sound so foreign she barely recognized it as her own. It felt rusty, dredged up from a part of herself she thought had died. She laughed until tears pricked the corners of her eyes, a laugh of surprise and relief, and a glimmer of something that felt dangerously like joy. Boone stared at her, his initial awkwardness replaced by stunned silence. It was the first time he had ever heard her make a sound that wasn't born of necessity or sorrow. A slow, hesitant smile touched the corner of his own mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. The next day, they started the garden. Boone used a shovel to break the hard, unforgiving earth in a small patch behind the kitchen. Clara followed, her hands in the soil, clearing stones and breaking up the larger clumps. They worked in a comfortable silence, the shared labor a conversation in itself. He built a small fence of scrap wood to keep out stray animals. She carefully planted the few seeds she had found in the pantry, beans and squash. As they stood back to survey their work, two small, hopeful rows in a square of freshly turned earth. Boone leaned against the fence. "If you stay," he said, his voice quiet. "This place could have some green?" It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air like one. It was the closest he had ever come to asking. That evening, a cool breeze drifted down from the mountains, chasing away the day's heat. They sat on the edge of the porch, a respectful distance between them, watching the stars begin to prick the deep violet sky. The shared vulnerability of the garden, of creating something new together, had loosened the tightly held secrets within them. "He was a minister," Clara said softly into the twilight, her voice barely a whisper. Boone didn't look at her, but his body tensed. He knew who she meant. "Reverend Burton," she continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He was handsome and charming, and all the ladies in the town thought I was the luckiest woman alive. He spoke of God's love from the pulpit on Sunday, and of a wife's duty at home for the rest of the week. He said the Bible commanded a wife to be subservient, to obey without question. He said pain was a way of purifying the soul from the sin of female vanity. She took a shaky breath. He used his belt to purify me often, and afterwards, he would kneel and pray for my soul, while I was the one bleeding. She fell silent. The confession, spoken aloud for the first time, left her feeling hollowed out, exposed. She waited for his judgment, for his revulsion. Boone was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I killed 3 men." His words were flat. Hard facts dropped into the quiet night. Clara turned to look at him. His face was a mask of shadows, his jaw tight. "It was a few years after my folks died and left me this place. A trio of rustlers thought a young man alone was an easy target. They came in the night, looking to run off with my herd. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't think. I just took my rifle from the wall." He finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "They came to steal. I just pulled the trigger. All 3 of them. Buried them out on the flats where nothing grows." He looked down at his hands, large and calloused, as if seeing them for the first time. "People in town talk. They say I'm a killer. They're not wrong." He had offered her his own scar, his own dark truth, in exchange for hers. He was a killer. She was the abused wife of a holy man. They were both damaged, both survivors of a brutal world. There was no judgment in her heart, only a deep, aching wave of understanding. Slowly, tentatively, she reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his. His hand was rough and warm. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, his grip gentle but firm. Later, they moved inside, the chill of the desert night driving them toward the warmth of the hearth. The fire cast flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. They sat on the floor, on a rough spun rug before the flames, the silence between them now one of comfort, not tension, exhausted by the weight of her confession. Clara found her head growing heavy, hesitantly. She leaned over and rested her head on Boone's shoulder. He stiffened for a second, then relaxed, a silent acceptance. It was the first time she had willingly initiated contact with a man in years, the first time she had let herself believe she might be safe. His proximity was a solid, steady warmth. He smelled of leather, wood smoke, and the clean night air. He looked down at her, at the way the firelight caught the soft strands of her hair. He saw the trust in her gesture, the weary surrender. Slowly, believing it was the next step, he began to lower his head, his intent clear in his eyes. He was going to kiss her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her, the specter of her husband, of a man's touch meaning pain and violation, rose like a phantom from the past. With a small, involuntary gasp, she pulled back, pressing herself away from him. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm not ready." The hurt in his eyes was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Not anger, not frustration. It was a deep, pained understanding. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, showing her he meant no harm. He held her gaze for a long moment, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. "I'll wait," he said, his voice low and steady, a vow spoken into the quiet room. "I'll wait. Just don't leave." The quiet rhythm of the ranch was broken by the arrival of a man who did not belong. He rode in not on a dusty cow pony, but on a fine black gelding with a silver inlaid saddle. He wore a city suit of dark wool, wilted in the oppressive heat, and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He introduced himself as Jedediah Thorne, a representative of a railroad consortium, and he directed his business entirely to Boone, ignoring Clara as if she were a piece of the furniture. He sat at the kitchen table, which Clara had scrubbed to a pale white, and laid out his proposition. The railroad was coming through, and his employers wanted the McAllister land for a water stop and a new township. The price he offered was staggering, a sum that could buy a man a life of ease far from this harsh, unforgiving landscape. Boone stood by the hearth, his arms crossed over his chest, listening with an unnerving stillness. He did not even glance at the papers Thorne pushed across the table. When the man was finished with his slick, practiced speech, the silence in the room was absolute. "This ranch belonged to my father," Boone said, his voice flat. "And his father before him. It ain't for sale." Thorne's smile tightened. "Mr. McAllister, be reasonable. This is a fortune, a man alone. Out here, it's a hard life. Things happen, accidents, fires, rustlers. It would be a shame to lose everything for the sake of sentiment." The threat was as clear as the glass in the window pane. "Get off my land," Boone said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Thorne gathered his papers with a sigh of theatrical disappointment. "You will regret this," he said, before striding out of the house and riding away, leaving a trail of dust and ill will in his wake. In the weeks that followed, a new routine began in the quiet hours after the evening meal. Eli, the quiet, lanky orphan boy, who was not much older than 15, would linger in the kitchen, his hat clutched in his hands, his eyes full of a desperate, unspoken wish. Clara, seeing the hunger for knowledge in his face, had offered to teach him his letters, using a piece of charcoal on the back of an old shipping manifest. She would guide his calloused finger over the shapes of the alphabet. He was a slow but determined student, and the look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face when he finally sounded out the word DOG was a reward richer than any sum Jedediah Thorne could offer. One evening, Boone returned late from mending a fence line on the far pasture. He walked toward the house, the day's weariness heavy on his shoulders. Through the kitchen window, he saw them. The lamplight cast a warm, golden glow on the scene. Clara was leaning over the table, her face soft with patience, pointing to a word on the paper. Eli was hunched beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration. The house was quiet, filled with a sense of peace Boone had never known it to possess. It looked like a home. It looked like a family. An unfamiliar, painful emotion clenched in his chest. He saw Clara's gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of encouragement, and something inside his hardened heart broke open. He felt a stinging in his eyes, a thickness in his throat. He, Boone McAllister, the man who had buried 3 rustlers without shedding a tear, was on the verge of weeping at the sight of a reading lesson. He turned away sharply, scrubbing a rough hand over his eyes, and retreated into the shadows of the barn before anyone could witness his moment of weakness. The news arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the mail rider who passed through once a month. It was a single, thin envelope, addressed to her in a familiar hand from her old town. Clara's heart seized with a cold, familiar dread. For years, any unexpected letter had meant a summons, a complaint, a new rule to be followed. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely break the seal. The letter was from an old neighbor, a woman who had sometimes offered a pitying look but never a helping hand. The words were terse, factual. The yellow fever had swept through the county with a vengeance. Many had been taken. The Reverend Burton, her husband, had been among them. He had been buried 2 weeks prior. The letter ended with a line that was meant to be a condolence. But for Clara, it was a proclamation. Asterisk, you are free now. Clara May. Free. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of her mind. She sank onto her stool, the letter fluttering from her numb fingers to the floor. She was a widow, a true widow, not just a runaway wife. The monster that had haunted her dreams was gone, turned to dust and memory. There was no relief. Not yet, only a vast, terrifying emptiness. The bars of her cage had vanished, and she had no idea what to do with the open sky. She told Boone that evening. He listened, his face impassive, as she relayed the news in a faltering voice. He didn't offer congratulations or condolences. He simply watched her, his blue eyes searching her face, and when she was done, he gave a single, curt nod. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her ghosts and her freedom. He did not come in for supper. The men ate, casting nervous glances at his empty chair. One of them mentioned Boone had taken a bottle of whiskey to the barn. A soft rain began to fall, tapping a gentle, mournful rhythm on the roof. The silence in the house grew, becoming a heavy, oppressive thing. Clara couldn't bear it. Taking a deep breath, she lit a lantern and walked out into the damp night. She found him in the cavernous dark of the barn, sitting in a pile of clean hay in an empty stall. Diablo nickered softly from the next stall over. The air was thick with the scent of horses, hay, and spilled liquor. The half-empty bottle sat beside him. He wasn't drunk, not in the way her husband used to be. He was just unraveled. The iron control was gone, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable. He looked up as she approached, his eyes shadowed and bleak in the lantern light. "He's gone," Boone said, his voice thick. "So now you can leave. Go back. Claim what was yours. Start over." He wasn't looking at her, but at some distant point in the darkness. "You're free of him. You're free of this place." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw fear in his eyes struck her to the core. "But I don't want you to go. Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. It fell from his lips like a prayer and a curse. It was a confession of a need so profound it terrified him. The rain pattered on the roof. The fear he so openly displayed gave her a strange, unexpected strength. She had taken a small drink of the whiskey herself before coming out, a single shot to still the trembling in her own soul, and its warmth now spread through her veins as courage. Words were useless. She walked into the stall, set the lantern down, and knelt in the hay in front of him. Then, for the first time in her life, she reached for a man not out of duty or fear, but out of her own volition. She put her arms around his neck and pulled herself against him, burying her face in the rough wool of his shirt. He was rigid with shock for a moment. Then a shudder went through his entire body. His arms came around her, crushing her to him, his face buried in her hair. He held her as if he were a drowning man, and she was the last piece of solid land on earth. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The kiss was not one of passion, but of desperation. It was a raw, searching, questioning thing. And Clara, to her own astonishment, answered it. A desire she thought had been beaten out of her flickered to life, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She was shaking, a violent tremor that was equal parts fear and a desperate, aching need to be touched, to be held, to be wanted. Boone felt the tremor and pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. He saw the war within her, and he waited. He became the patient man from her journal, the one who coaxed life from barren soil. His touch, when it came again, was impossibly gentle. His hands moved over her back, not with demand, but with a reverence that unmade her. He was learning the topography of her pain, tracing the scars through her dress with a feather-light touch that was a balm to her soul. Every movement was a question, giving her space to retreat, to say no. But she didn't. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. The rain fell harder, a steady drumming that cocooned them from the rest of the world, in the sweet-smelling darkness of the barn, surrounded by the soft sounds of horses breathing. Clara let go. It was a clumsy, hesitant, and profoundly healing collision of two broken souls, a reclaiming of all that had been stolen from her. It was not about pleasure. It was about connection, about the stunning, miraculous discovery that a man's touch could be a comfort, not a weapon. They did not sleep. They'd lay in the hay, wrapped in a horse blanket and each other's arms. As the rain softened to a drizzle and then stopped, they talked in low murmurs, sharing small, simple truths about their lives, pieces of themselves they had never offered to anyone else. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, illuminating the dancing dust motes, the world outside was silent and new. He was looking at her, his face clear in the gray light. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. He reached up and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm begging you," he whispered, his voice thick with the night's confessions and the morning's uncertainty. "Stay." That morning in the barn became a silent, unacknowledged foundation upon which a new life was built. The change in the ranch was not loud or sudden, but a slow, steady seeping of warmth into places that had long been cold. The green shoots in Clara's small garden behind the kitchen pushed defiantly through the hard-packed earth, a mirror of the tentative hope that was taking root in the hearts of those who lived there. The ranch hands, who had once looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt, now saw her differently. Their bunkhouse whispers had died, replaced by a gruff, unspoken respect. They stopped seeing a beaten widow and began to see the woman who had made this harsh place feel more like a home. It was in the small things. Hank, the oldest hand, would now tip his hat to her in the morning. Young Eli would save the first desert wildflower he found for the small jar she kept on the windowsill. They began to call her Ma'am, and sometimes even Clara. They saw the way Boone's gaze would find her across the dusty yard, a look of fierce, quiet possession that warned the world away. They understood she was more than the cook. She was the steady flame in the hearth, the quiet center around which their rough lives had begun to orbit. The public declaration came, as such things often do, without ceremony. A cattle buyer named Abernathy, a bluff, hearty man with a booming laugh, came to negotiate a price for 100 head of steer. After the deal was struck and the handshake given, Abernathy stayed for the noon meal. He ate with gusto, complimenting Clara's stew in a loud, friendly voice. As he was leaving, he clapped Boone on the shoulder. "You keep a fine cook, McAllister. A woman like that is worth her weight in gold out here." Boone, who was standing on the porch, turned his head slightly to where Clara was clearing the table just inside the door. She froze, listening. His voice, when he replied, was low and clear, carrying with absolute finality in the still afternoon air. "She's not the cook," he said, his gaze fixed on Abernathy. "She's mine." The words were simple, possessive, and absolute. It was not a romantic pronouncement. It was a statement of fact, a drawing of a boundary line around her that was as real and solid as a barbed wire fence. Abernathy's jovial expression shifted to one of immediate understanding and respect. He tipped his hat deeply in Clara's direction. "My apologies, ma'am. A pleasure to make your acquaintance." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "She's mine." The words should have terrified her, echoing the possessiveness of the man she had escaped. But coming from Boone, they sounded different. They sounded like a shield. They sounded like belonging. But the past is a stubborn ghost, and it does not give up its haunting easily. It rode in on a tired-looking mule a week later, in the form of a man with shifty, watery eyes and a threadbare coat that was too warm for the season. He was thin and stooped, with a damp, unpleasant smile. Clara was feeding the chickens when he dismounted, and her blood ran cold. She knew him. His name was Phineas Finch, a man who had been a deacon in her husband's church, a creature who thrived on gossip and the misfortunes of others. "Clara May," he said, his voice a greasy whine. "As I live and breathe, we all thought you'd succumb to your grief after the good Reverend passed." "What do you want, Phineas?" she asked, her voice tight. His eyes darted around the ranch, taking in the solid barn, the healthy-looking cattle, and the imposing figure of Boone, who was watching them from the corral. "I was just passing through," he lied smoothly. "Heard there might be work, but to find you here, well, it's a miracle. The town mourned you, you know. They all believed you'd wandered into the wilderness, overcome with sorrow." His smile widened, showing stained teeth. It would be a terrible shame if they were to learn that the grieving widow had, in fact, run away before her husband had even taken sick. People might misunderstand. The blackmail was laid bare. He knew her secret. He knew the timeline. He saw her new life, and he wanted a piece of it. "How much?" she whispered, her stomach churning with a familiar, sickening dread. $100 should be enough, he said, his eyes gleaming. "To help me on my way, and to ensure the Reverend's memory remains pristine." He left her then, saying he would be at the saloon in the nearest settlement until nightfall. She stood by the chicken coop, shaking, the world tilting on its axis. She had been free for such a short time. Boone knew the second he saw her face. The light had gone out of her eyes, replaced by the haunted, hunted look she'd worn when she first arrived. He cornered her in the kitchen, his presence filling the small space. "What did he want?" he demanded, his voice low. She tried to evade, to lie, but she was a poor liar, and he saw right through it. With halting, shamed words, she told him everything. About Phineas, about the threat, about the money. As she spoke, she watched Boone change. The quiet, patient man she had come to know disappeared, and in his place stood the killer he had confessed to being. A terrifying stillness came over him. His eyes went flat and cold, the blue turning to the color of ice on a winter lake. His face became a hard, unforgiving mask. Without a word, he turned and strode to the wall where his gun belt hung. He checked the pistol in the holster, his movements economical and deadly. Clara flew across the room and stood in front of him, blocking his path to the door. "No," she pleaded, her hands pressed against his chest. It was like trying to stop a mountain from moving. "He's a dead man," Boone said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He tried to move around her. "No, Boone, please," she cried, grabbing his arms. "You can't. Think about what you're doing. If you kill him, you'll be a wanted man. We'll have to run, but it's more than that." She looked up into his cold, distant eyes, willing him to see her, to hear her. "If you do this, you let him drag you back down into that darkness. You'll be that man again, the one who buries his problems on the flats. Don't let him do that to you. Don't let him take you from me." Her words, "Take you from me," were the only thing that could have reached him. A flicker of something, pain, conflict, returned to his eyes. His body remained rigid, coiled with a violence that demanded release. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my ghost, Boone. Let me be the one to lay it to rest." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, the war raging within him. Finally, with a shuddering breath, the tension seemed to drain out of him, leaving him weary and grim. He stepped back from the gun belt. He didn't agree, but he didn't stop her when she took the small tin box from the pantry where he kept the ranch's money. She rode one of the gentler horses into the settlement, the weight of the coins in her satchel a heavy burden. She found Phineas Finch in the saloon, just as he'd said, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand. She walked directly to his table and dropped the heavy canvas bag of coins in front of him. It landed with a loud, definitive thud. "There's your money," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the low murmur of the saloon. "You will take it. You will ride east, and you will never come back. You will never speak my name or my husband's name again. If I ever see you again, or hear that you have been talking, I will tell Boone everything, and he will not be as merciful as I am." Finch looked from the money to her face, a flicker of fear in his eyes at the cold conviction in her voice. He scooped up the bag. "Pleasure doing business with you. Widow." "I am not a widow," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I am a survivor. Remember that." She turned and walked out, not looking back. When she returned to the ranch, she found Boone pacing on the porch, his body tight with anxiety. He stopped when he saw her, a wave of relief washing over his face, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, troubled sadness. "It's done," she said quietly. "He's gone." "For now," Boone said, his voice rough. He looked out at the vast, darkening plains, at the horizon that offered no real protection. "I couldn't protect you. He walked onto my land, and he hurt you, and I couldn't stop it." He finally looked at her, his face etched with a pain that went deeper than anger. "When I was a boy, my mother took sick with a lung fever. My father was the strongest man I ever knew. He could break a wild horse, build a house with his own 2 hands. But he couldn't stop the sickness. I watched him sit by her bed, big and strong and completely helpless. He couldn't protect her." He shook his head, a terrible vulnerability in his eyes. "That's how I feel right now. I'm so afraid of losing you, Clara, so afraid that I'm not strong enough to keep you safe." The confession laid his soul bare. She saw it all then, his solitude, his hardness, his fierce protectiveness. It was all a fortress built around the fear of being helpless, of losing someone he loved. She stepped toward him and took his large, calloused hands in hers. She waited until he met her eyes. "Boone," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I don't need you to save me. I just need you to stand beside me." Her words, "I just need you to stand beside me," became their unspoken creed. The fear that had gripped Boone after the encounter with Phineas Finch did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the helpless terror of a boy watching his mother fade. It was the focused vigilance of a man with something precious to protect. He and Clara moved forward into a new season, their partnership settling into a quiet, powerful rhythm that resonated through every corner of the ranch. The garden she had planted flourished, producing a small but determined crop of squash and beans, a testament to her persistence. It was a time of fragile peace, a stolen autumn of golden days and cool, clear nights. But the high plains are a place of brutal extremes, and the peace was short-lived. Winter came early that year, not with a gentle dusting of frost, but like an invading army. A bitter wind swept down from the northern mountains, carrying with it a slate-gray sky that promised a long and merciless season. The first snow fell in late October, a thick, wet blanket that smothered the last of the autumn color and turned the world to monochrome. During the first storm, a young calf, born late in the season, wandered from its mother and became lost in the swirling snow and freezing rain. Without a second thought, Clara pulled on one of Boone's oversized oilskin coats and went out to search for it, unwilling to let the creature perish. She found it, shivering and half-frozen in a shallow ravine, and managed to guide it back to the warmth of the barn. But the cost was high. She returned to the house soaked to the bone, her body racked with a chill that no fire could seem to touch. By morning, the chill had become a raging fever. She was delirious, her skin burning one moment and icy cold the next. A dry, rattling cough settled deep in her chest, each spasm of it leaving her weaker than before. The ranch hands looked on with worried, helpless eyes as Boone carried her from her small room in the lean-to and placed her in his own bed. The first time she had ever been in that part of the house. It was a Spartan room, dominated by a sturdy wooden bed frame his father had built. But it was the warmest room in the house, with the best hearth. Boone became her keeper. He sent young Eli on the fastest horse to the nearest settlement, a full day's ride, to fetch a doctor, but he knew the doctor might not come, or might be too late. The real fight was here, now. He dismissed the other men from the house, telling them to manage the ranch as best they could. His world shrank to the four walls of that room, to the woman lying feverish in his bed. For 3 days and 3 nights, he did not sleep. He sat in a chair by her bed, a basin of cool water at his side, wiping her brow with a gentle hand. He spooned broth between her cracked lips, coaxing her to take what little nourishment she could. He fed the fire, keeping the room a pocket of determined warmth against the howling winter outside. He listened to the rasp of her breathing, his own breath catching in his throat with every painful-sounding gasp she took. The terror he had confessed to her before was nothing compared to this. This was the raw, primal fear of loss, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow the first light that had entered his life in a decade. She was everything: the warmth in his house, the green in his garden, the steady beat of a heart next to his own. The thought of this place without her, of it returning to the silent, empty shell it had been, was a fate more terrifying than any gunfight. In her delirium, she drifted through the haunted landscapes of her past. She would murmur the names of the ranch hands, or call out for Diablo, Boone's horse. But on the third night, when the fever was at its peak and her life hung by the thinnest of threads, she began to struggle against the blankets, her eyes wide with a terror that was not of the fever. "No," she whimpered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "No, please, Burton, don't." Boone froze, his hand hovering over her forehead. He had heard her speak of her husband, but to hear his name now, in this context, was like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she cried, twisting her head on the pillow, her hands coming up as if to ward off a strike. "I'll be good. Please, don't hit me again. Please, don't hit me." The words shattered the last of his defenses. The sight of this strong, resilient woman reduced to a terrified, pleading child by the ghosts that still lived inside her broke him. A great, ragged sob was torn from his chest. He bent over, his forehead resting on the edge of the bed beside her hand, and for the first time since he was a small boy mourning his mother, Boone McAllister wept. Tears of rage for the man who had hurt her, tears of grief for the pain she had endured, and tears of sheer, desperate fear that he was about to lose her. He cried until he was empty, his silent, body-racking sobs the only sound in the room besides the crackle of the fire and Clara's tortured breathing. Towards dawn on the fourth day, the fever broke, her breathing eased, and the frantic, tormented energy left her. She fell into a deep, natural sleep. Boone, utterly exhausted, finally allowed himself to slump in the chair, his head falling back as he drifted into a fitful, dreamless doze. When he awoke, the afternoon sun was streaming through the window, glinting off the fresh snow outside. He blinked, his body aching with fatigue, and saw that Clara was awake. She was watching him, her eyes clear and lucid for the first time in days. She was terribly pale and weak, but she was herself. "Boone," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He was at her side in an instant, a cup of water in his hand, helping her to sit up and drink. The simple relief of it was so overwhelming he felt light-headed. She looked around the room, at the sturdy furniture, at the worn quilt that covered her. She looked at his face, at the dark circles of exhaustion under his eyes and the new lines of worry etched around his mouth. She saw what he had done for her. She saw the truth of his devotion in his weariness. "I heard you," she said, her voice barely audible. "When I was away, I heard your voice. You stayed." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick. A shadow passed over her face, the memory of her own delirium. She looked down at her hands, at the way the quilt was frayed at the edges. "You know," she whispered, "what I am? What was done to me? I'm not whole. Boone, I'm damaged goods, like a cracked plate that can never be truly fixed." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, her vulnerability a raw, open wound. "After all that, can I still stay? Is there a place for someone like me here?" He took her hand, his large, rough palm completely enveloping hers. He leaned in close, his gaze intense and unwavering, willing her to see the truth in his words. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are not the cracked plate. You are the light that shines through the cracks." He took a deep breath, searching for the right words to convey the immensity of what he felt. He gave up, realizing that only the simplest truth would do. "You are everything." Her tears finally spilled over, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a final, deeply felt acceptance. He was not her savior, but he was her harbor. This was her home. That night, after she had eaten a little and regained some of her strength. The air between them was different. The last barriers of fear and hesitation had been burned away in the crucible of the fever. The ghosts had been faced, and though their shadows might always linger, they no longer held any power. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand, in the warm, flickering firelight. There were no words, only a deep, profound understanding that flowed between them. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was a promise of a new beginning. There was no fear in her response, only a quiet, joyful surrender. This time, there was no hesitation, no ghosts to pull them apart. It was a sweet, gentle coming together, a confirmation of all the unspoken things their hearts had known for months. In the warmth of his bed, with a blizzard raging outside, they held each other, hand in hand, heart to heart, finally whole in their shared brokenness. They awoke late the next morning to a world of brilliant, blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep, pristine blanket of snow that muffled all sound. A profound peace settled over the ranch. For the first time, the future felt not like something to be survived, but something to be welcomed. But as Boone stood on the porch, looking out at the transformed landscape, he saw them, 3 riders, dark figures moving slowly against the white expanse, coming from the east. They were still miles away, but he did not need to see them clearly to know who they were. It was Jedediah Thorne. And the 2 men who rode on either side of him were not ranchers. They were gunmen, their purpose as clear and as cold as the winter air. Boone's brief, precious peace shattered. The storm outside had passed, but a far more dangerous one was about to break. The 3 riders did not hurry. They moved across the snow-covered plains with the slow, deliberate menace of circling vultures, their dark forms a stark violation of the landscape's pristine white. Boone watched them from the porch, his body rigid, the brief, warm peace of the morning evaporating into the frigid air. He felt Clara come to stand beside him, her hand finding his. She did not need to ask who they were. She could feel the threat rolling off them in waves. Jedediah Thorne reined in his horse a dozen yards from the house, his 2 companions flanking him. They were not cowhands. They were hard-faced men with low-slung gun belts and a cold, dead look in their eyes that spoke of a familiarity with violence. Thorne's city smile was gone, replaced by a sneer of undisguised contempt. McAllister, he called out, his voice sharp in the stillness. I've come to make you one final offer. Sign the deed over to me now, and I'll let you and your woman walk away with your lives. Refuse, and I'll burn this place to the ground with you in it. The snow will cover the ashes, and by spring, no one will even remember you were here. Boone's hand rested on the worn wooden grip of the pistol at his hip. This is my last warning. Thorne, turn around and ride out. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. Wrong answer. He gestured to one of his gunmen. Give him a taste of what's to come. The gunman drew his pistol with lazy speed and fired. The bullet didn't strike the house or anyone in it. It hit the wooden sign that read McAllister Ranch, splintering them into a shower of wooden shards. It was a message, a promise of casual destruction. With another chilling laugh, Thorne wheeled his horse around. I'll be back after sundown to collect your answer, he shouted over his shoulder. Have the deed ready. Then the 3 of them rode off, disappearing over a low rise, leaving behind only the echo of the gunshot and the scent of gunpowder on the cold air. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. Boone turned and grabbed Clara by the shoulders, his face a grim mask of urgency. Get your things, he said, his voice rough. Just what you can carry. Eli can take you on the fastest horse. You'll head south, toward Santa Fe. Don't stop until you get there. Clara looked at him, at the raw fear for her safety that lay beneath his hardened exterior. She saw his plan, to send her away, to get her clear of the danger so he could face it alone, unburdened. A year ago, She would have run without a second thought, but she was no longer that woman. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Clara, this ain't a discussion," he growled, his grip tightening. "These men are killers. I won't have you here when they come back." She reached up and placed her hands over his on her shoulders. "Boone, look at me." She waited until his frantic eyes met hers. "When I first came here, this was just a place to sleep. Then it became a sanctuary. Now," she took a deep breath, "this ranch is my home. The garden I planted is buried under that snow. The roof you kept over my head when I was sick is right there. The man I love is standing right in front of me. I am not running anymore. My place is here, beside you." Her words struck him silent. He saw the truth in her eyes, an unbreakable resolve that mirrored his own. She was not the person he needed to save. She was the partner he needed to stand with. He let out a long, shuddering breath and pulled her into a hard, desperate embrace. "All right," he whispered into her hair. "All right, we stand together." The day was spent in a flurry of grim preparation. The ranch transformed into a makeshift fortress. Boone, his face set like granite, gave orders to the hands. They trusted him, but they were ranchers, not soldiers, and the fear was plain on their faces. It was Clara who provided the steady, calming influence, while Boone focused on the weapons and the defense of the house. She thought of their survival. "Eli, Hank," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "We need to move the breeding cows and the calves into the far canyon. They'll be hidden there. The rest of the herd will have to take its chances." She organized the younger hands, directing them to move sacks of flour, cured meat, and other provisions from the pantry into the storm cellar. She filled every available bucket and barrel with water, knowing that if Thorne intended to use fire, water would be more precious than bullets. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her actions quelling the rising panic. She was preparing not just for a gunfight, but for a siege, for the long haul. Boone watched her, a sense of awe cutting through his fear. She was not just the heart of his home. She was its spine. As dusk bled across the snow, turning it from brilliant white to shades of purple and blue, a tense quiet fell. They were as ready as they could be. Boone stood by the front window, his rifle in his hands. The other hands were positioned at other windows, their own weapons at the ready. Clara was in the kitchen, loading Boone's spare pistol, her movements sure and steady. The attack came after the moon was high. It wasn't a full-on assault. It was a test, a terror tactic. Two dark figures crept toward the barn, one of them carrying a lit torch. "They're going for the barn," Boone said, his voice a low growl. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot kicked up snow a foot from the man with the torch, who yelped and dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. An answering shot flashed from the shadows. The window pane beside Boone's head exploded inward. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching his arm. Clara was at his side in an instant. "I'm all right," he grunted, though his face was pale. "It just grazed me." Blood was seeping through his sleeve, a dark stain against the fabric. As Clara frantically tried to assess the wound, another figure broke from the darkness, running low and fast toward the house itself. This one also held a torch, its flames licking hungrily at the night air. He was going to set fire to the porch. Boone tried to raise his rifle again, but his injured arm made his movements clumsy. The gunman was almost there. In that moment, Clara moved. She grabbed the rifle from a terrified Eli, her face set with a cold, hard resolve he had never seen before. She didn't hesitate. She threw open the front door and stepped out onto the porch, planting her feet firmly, the long rifle held steady in her hands. The gunman stopped dead, surprised by her sudden appearance. He was a dozen yards away, the torchlight illuminating his cruel, bearded face. He raised his pistol, a sneer on his lips, expecting her to cower. She did not. She stood there, a lone woman in a simple dress, framed by the warm light of the doorway, facing down an armed man. She didn't try to aim the rifle like an expert. She simply held it, pointed at his chest, but it was the look in her eyes that made him falter. It was not the look of a frightened victim. It was the look of someone who had already faced down the worst the world had to offer and had survived. It was the look of a person who was not afraid to die, and that made her infinitely more dangerous than any trained shooter. Her gaze was a promise that if he took one more step, she would pull the trigger, and whatever happened to her, he was coming with her. The gunman's sneer wavered. He took a half step back. The shot Boone had fired. The sudden appearance of help from an unexpected quarter. It had all been heard. From the distance, another sound cut through the night, the thunder of approaching horses and the shouts of men. A group of riders crested the nearby hill, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. It was their neighbors, men from the surrounding ranches, men who had once whispered about the beaten widow. They had heard the shots, seen the distant flicker of a torch, and had come to investigate. They saw the gunman, the blood on Boone's arm, and the lone woman standing her ground on the porch. And they understood everything. A woman who stands firm in a storm deserves to be protected. Seeing they were now outnumbered, Thorne's gunman fired a few wild shots into the air before melting back into the darkness. The immediate threat was over. The neighbors rode into the yard, their faces grim, offering their help. The ranch, for tonight, was safe. In the sudden, chaotic aftermath, with men talking in low, angry voices and the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, Boone saw only Clara. She was still standing on the porch, the heavy rifle now seeming to weigh her down. He walked over to her, his arm throbbing, his heart overflowing. In front of everyone, he gently took the rifle from her hands and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, grounding himself in the solid, living reality of her. "My whole life," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. His words meant for her alone. "My whole life was a desert, until you came." The siege of McAllister Ranch ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Thorne and his gunmen, having underestimated the resilience of their target and the solidarity of the local community, vanished back into the vastness from which they came. The threat of the railroad consortium faded, the whispers on the wind suggesting they had found an easier, less troublesome path for their tracks. The neighbors who had ridden to their aid became friends, their shared defense forging a bond of mutual respect that was stronger than any fence line. The winter, having thrown its worst at them, finally broke its back. Spring arrived like a long-held, answered prayer. As the deep snows receded, the world was reborn in shades of tender green. The first thing Clara did was check her garden. Under the melting slush, she found them, a dozen tiny, determined green shoots, pushing their way through the cold, damp earth toward the sun. She knelt and touched a leaf with the tip of her finger, a wave of profound, simple joy washing over her. They had survived. They had all survived. The ranch came back to life. The sounds of hammers and saws replaced the howl of the wind as the men repaired the bullet-splintered sign and the broken window. The cattle, brought down from the canyon, grew fat on the new spring grass. And in the heart of the ranch house, another kind of growth was taking place. With the immediate danger gone, Clara's nurturing spirit, once focused solely on survival, now had room to expand. She started with Eli. His reading lessons, interrupted by the winter's turmoil, resumed. But soon, two younger boys from a neighboring ranch, sons of a widower who had been among those who rode to their aid, began to appear in the afternoons, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with curiosity. Word had spread of the learning that was happening at the McAllister place. Clara, with Boone's quiet, unwavering support, cleared out a small, unused storage room, whitewashed the walls, and fashioned a rough plank into a desk. She became a teacher. Her school had no slates, no proper books, only charcoal sticks, old catalogs, and a shared, tattered copy of the Bible from which she taught the alphabet. Her students were a handful of rough-and-tumble ranch children who were more comfortable on the back of a horse than on a bench. But in that small, sunlit room, she gave them a gift more valuable than land or cattle. She gave them the world of words. She taught them to read, to write their own names, to calculate sums. She gave them a window out of the beautiful, hard, and often isolating life into which they had been born. Boone would often stand in the doorway of the barn, pretending to mend a piece of tack, and just watch. He would see her through the window, her head bent close to a child's, her voice a low, patient murmur. He saw the fierce concentration on the children's faces, the dawning of understanding in their eyes. He saw the woman he loved not just surviving, but building. She was planting seeds not only in the earth, but in the future of this land, in its children. And the love he felt for her in those moments was a quiet, overwhelming force, a feeling so immense it filled his chest and made it hard to breathe. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn the color of a fading rose, he took her hand. "Marry me, Clara," he said. It wasn't a question, but a simple, declarative statement, as solid and real as the land beneath their feet. She didn't feign surprise. It felt like the most natural, inevitable thing in the world. She simply turned her hand in his, lacing her fingers through his own. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Boone." Their wedding was not held in a church. There was no preacher, no organ music, no crowd of well-wishers. It was an affair as simple and true as their love had become. They chose to stand beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient cottonwood tree that grew near the main corral. It was a silent, stoic sentinel that had witnessed generations of McAllisters work this land. It was the tree she had stood beside on her first day, watching him ride in. A man who seemed as hard and unforgiving as the landscape itself. The ranch hands were their only witnesses. They stood in a shy, respectful semicircle, their hats held in their hands, their Sunday clothes still smelling faintly of mothballs. Eli, his face shining with pride, served as Boone's best man. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton she had ordered from a catalog, its crispness a stark contrast to the patched, trail-dusted garment she had arrived in. She wore no veil, no jewelry, only a small, wild columbine tucked into her hair, its delicate petals the same shade as her dress. Boone stood tall and straight, looking not at the men, but only at her. He didn't speak of God or forever. His vows were spoken in a low, clear voice that carried in the quiet air, a promise made from the very core of his being. "Clara," he began, his gaze holding hers, "before you came, I was just living, existing. This place was just dirt and wood. You taught me how to make it a home. You showed me that my own heart wasn't as dead as I thought it was." He took her hands in his. "I can't promise you an easy life. This land doesn't allow for it. But I promise to stand beside you. I promise to listen to you, to protect you, and to honor you every day that I have left. I promise that you will never, ever be alone again." When it was her turn, Clara's voice was soft, but every man there heard the strength that ran beneath it like a river. "Boone," she said, her eyes shining. "I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a past I was desperate to outrun. I was looking for a roof over my head. I never expected to find a home for my soul. You took in a stranger, a broken thing, and you were patient. You were kind. You gave me a place to heal." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "You gave me back to myself. I promised to share the burdens and the joys. I promised to put green things in your garden and warmth in your house. And I promised to love you, not just for the strong man you are, but for the good man I know you to be." They sealed their vows not with a ring, for they had none, but with a long, gentle kiss, a silent affirmation witnessed by the ancient tree and the wide open sky. The final scene of their story unfolded many months later, as summer was giving way to the golden hues of their second autumn together. The ranch was quiet, the day's work done. They sat together on the porch swing Boone had built, its slow, rhythmic creak, a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. The sun was a fiery orb, sinking behind the distant red rock mountains, painting the clouds in spectacular strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and drying grass. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, the kind of quiet joy they had both thought was lost to them forever. They sat in comfortable silence, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, their hands clasped together in her lap. He looked out at the majestic, painted sky, at the vast and beautiful land that was his home, his birthright. But then he looked down at the woman beside him, at the soft curve of her cheek in the fading light, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she was the true landscape of his life. He gently squeezed her hand. "You still feel like leaving?" he asked, his voice a low, soft rumble. It was a gentle question, a loving acknowledgement of the long, dusty road she had walked to find her way to this porch, to this moment. Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the jagged peaks. A profound sense of peace, deeper and more complete than any she had ever known, filled her. She was no longer running. She was home. She turned her head slightly, looking up at his strong, familiar profile outlined against the twilight sky. She slowly shook her head, a small, definitive movement. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable truth. "Because this is the place where I am loved, for who I am." Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier, and feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Boone's journey.